In 1991, there were no billionaires in Russia. Not because wealth didn't exist, it did, concentrated in state assets worth trillions of dollars. But no individual in the Soviet Union legally owned any of it. Every factory, every oil field, every mine, every bank was property of the state. By 2000, Russia had 8 billionaires. By 2008, it had 87, more than any country in the world except the United States. The fastest creation of extreme private wealth in modern economic history happened in a single decade, through a process that transferred the entire Soviet industrial base to a tiny number of individuals. Understanding how it happened is not just about Russia. It is about what happens when a command economy dissolves without functioning institutions to manage the transition. The economic theory behind Russia's transition was called shock therapy: rapid, simultaneous liberalization of prices, privatization of state assets, and opening of the economy to market forces. The theory, advocated by Western economists and international institutions including the IMF, held that a rapid transition would be painful but short, and that market forces would quickly begin allocating resources efficiently. The alternative, gradual transition, would allow vested interests to capture reform and slow it to a halt. Shock therapy had worked, with modifications, in Poland and the Czech Republic. It did not work in Russia for one fundamental reason. Those countries had functioning legal institutions. Russia had none. Liberalizing prices without legal infrastructure to enforce contracts does not produce markets. It produces the strongest actors extracting value from the weakest. Price liberalization in January 1992 eliminated personal savings overnight. Hyperinflation wiped out the ruble savings of ordinary Russians within months. The population that was supposed to benefit from privatization entered it with no financial resources to participate. The people who did have resources were the ones who had controlled Soviet economic flows under the old system. Factory directors, party officials, black market entrepreneurs, and anyone who had converted ruble assets into hard currency before liberalization. The playing field for the greatest asset transfer in history was not level before it began. Voucher privatization began in October 1992. Every Russian citizen received a voucher with a nominal value of 10,000 rubles, theoretically equivalent to $10,000 at that exchange rate, though the real value immediately began falling as the ruble depreciated. Citizens could use their vouchers to purchase shares in the state enterprises being privatized. In theory, this would create widespread share ownership and a broad-based capitalist society. In practice, most ordinary Russians had no understanding of share markets, no ability to evaluate the companies being privatized, and an immediate need to convert their vouchers to cash to cover living costs during the hyperinflationary collapse of real wages. Voucher investment funds emerged to pool smallholder vouchers, and many of these funds were fraudulent, collecting vouchers and then collapsing, leaving holders with nothing. The vouchers of millions of Russians were acquired for cash by well-connected individuals and organizations who understood exactly what they were worth and who were positioned to bid in the privatization auctions. By the time voucher privatization ended in 1994, the most valuable Soviet enterprises had been transferred to a small number of people at prices that bore no relationship to their actual asset value. The mechanism that created the first generation of Russian billionaires specifically was the Loans for Shares program of 1995 and 1996. This was the privatization scheme that economists and historians consistently identify as the single most consequential episode in the creation of oligarchic capitalism in Russia. The scheme worked as follows. The Russian government needed cash to cover its fiscal deficit. Rather than borrowing from international markets at high interest rates, it borrowed from a small number of newly created private banks. As collateral for those loans, the government offered stakes in the most valuable remaining state enterprises: oil companies, metals producers, telecommunications companies. If the government defaulted on the loans, the banks would acquire the collateral permanently. The banks were designed to default. The collateral was acquired. Yukos, one of the world's most valuable oil companies, was transferred to Mikhail Khodorkovsky's Menatep Bank for $170 million. Its real value at the time was estimated at between $5 and $10 billion. Norilsk Nickel, the world's largest nickel producer, was transferred for $170 million against an estimated value of $2 billion. Sibneft Oil Company went for $100 million against an estimated market value of $3 billion. These were not market transactions. They were transfers of state assets to politically connected insiders at fractions of their real value, mediated through a financial structure that had been designed by the same insiders who received the assets. What did this concentration of wealth cost the broader Russian economy? The question is measurable. Countries with high inequality, as measured by the Gini coefficient, show lower sustained growth rates over long periods because wealth concentration reduces domestic consumption demand, limits human capital investment, and creates institutional structures that protect rents rather than enable competition. Russia's Gini coefficient rose sharply through the 1990s and has remained high. The oligarchic structure of Russian industry also created specific economic inefficiencies. Enterprises owned by oligarchs were managed to extract cash flows rather than to invest in productivity. Capital flight from Russia in the 1990s and 2000s totaled hundreds of billions of dollars. Offshore ownership structures meant that the profits of Russian industry flowed to Cyprus, the British Virgin Islands, and London, rather than being reinvested in the Russian economy. This is not speculative. The Bank of Russia and independent economists have documented it. The 2022 invasion of Ukraine triggered the largest coordinated seizure of oligarch assets in history. Western governments froze an estimated $300 billion in Russian state assets held abroad. They also froze private assets of sanctioned oligarchs, superyachts, private jets, real estate, and financial accounts. The superyachts became the visible symbol of this enforcement. Vessels worth $200 million seized in Spanish, Italian, German, and American ports. But the seizure of private assets has raised serious legal questions. Private wealth, even if acquired through morally questionable privatization, is legally distinct from state assets in Western legal systems. Most of the seized private assets remain in legal limbo as of 2024, with courts in multiple jurisdictions hearing ownership challenges. The state-level $300 billion in frozen central bank assets is a different category. That money may ultimately be directed toward Ukraine reconstruction under emerging international legal frameworks. What the data tells us is that the wealth created in the 1990s through the privatization of the Soviet Union is now at the center of the most consequential geopolitical conflict since the Cold War. The oligarch economy is not a historical phenomenon. It is a present-tense political reality. Subscribe to the Collapse Index. New data every week.